Okay, thank you. Hello. As Nina said, first I want to thank Epic High School North and Nina Roberto for inviting me to come speak about this very, very important topic today. It's an important topic, especially with our youth. So I just want to thank you so much for inviting us. My name is Jessica Melton. I'm the Bureau Chief of the Human Trafficking Bureau with the Queens County District Attorney's Office. I went to St. John's Law School here in Queens. And upon graduating, I immediately began to work at the DA's office in Queens. And I've been there 24 years. And I focus my career solely on the prosecution of New York State's human trafficking laws, which only took effect in November of 2007. So since 2007, that's what I focused my career on. Thankfully, in 2020, District Attorney Melinda Katz was elected as District Attorney in Queens County, and understanding that trafficking is such a significant issue affecting so many vulnerable people in our society, she created New York State's first human trafficking bureau and increased our staff in dealing with this problem. Actually, we're on the forefront here in Queens in combating trafficking. We in Queens County were the first, got the first conviction in all of New York State under that new law that first took effect after trial. And now we have the first human trafficking bureau. Can you move to the next slide, please? So in our bureau, we have 3 important missions. And my contact information of the bureau is going to be put up at the end of the presentation. But our first, you can put all of the windows up if they come up. So our first mission in the Bureau is to actively and aggressively investigate human trafficking crimes. There's 2 types of trafficking: sex trafficking and labor trafficking. And we do so because most people who traffic others and take advantage and exploit other people are doing it to make money, for a profit. So because of that, they often have more than one victim. So we want to make sure we're holding anybody that takes advantage of anybody in our society held accountable. But we do so placing equal importance on being victim-centered and trauma-informed. We want to make sure that we're not re-traumatizing any victims who experience trafficking by doing anything that they're uncomfortable with. We also want to make sure that anybody that we come into contact with that is being trafficked or was being trafficked or survived the trafficking situation is connected with resources and services. That could be housing services, it could be mental health services, it could be legal services, immigration assistance. So we make sure we work with our partner service care providers to do that. It's very, very important. Our bureau is here in Queens to help, regardless of if somebody wants to report the crime. Because oftentimes trafficking victims either fear their trafficker or they are emotionally connected to their trafficker, have some sort of feelings for them, and they're not ready to report. So we're here to help regardless if you report or not, regardless of immigration status. And our third mission in our bureau is what I'm doing here today, and that's our outreach. And that's what we've really been able to increase since District Attorney has created a bureau. And that's making sure we're giving the community, at-risk youth, and anybody who may come into contact with trafficking victims or survivors, the information they need to get them help and the information on how to report it. This is an important reason why we're here, is because we only see what we know. This is a very significant quote because I can tell you, I started my career in the Domestic Violence Bureau. And in retrospect, I believe that some of my cases I had as a young assistant that were domestic violence charges, now in retrospect, and knowing the information I know now, might have had trafficking situations going on, and I didn't know it because I didn't know the tools to look for it. So that's why it's so important you're here. You're already part of the solution in combating trafficking, despite gaining this information. Now, what is trafficking? That's the most important thing we need to figure out, because there are a lot of misconceptions about what trafficking actually is. A lot of the reasons for that is our media portrays trafficking in a certain way. For example, many people believe that trafficking involves movement across country lines or state lines, when in reality, there's no element of transportation needed to prove a trafficking situation. A person can be trafficked without ever leaving Queens County, without ever leaving their zip code, without ever leaving their home. They can be trafficked. Another misconception of trafficking is that it always involves physical violence. Sometimes trafficking situations, many times, do involve physical violence, but more commonly, traffickers use deep forms of psychological manipulation and control and fear to convince people to do things, to induce them to do things they don't want to do. And that could be working, it could be labor trafficking, or it could be sex trafficking. So as I said, there are two different types of trafficking: sex trafficking and labor trafficking. I'm going to give you some examples that specifically come out of the school system here in Queens. Thank you. Is that better?
Más específicos de lo que ha salido del sistema escolar.
Okay, so that's much better. Thank
Eso
you.
está mucho mejor.
Sex trafficking and labor trafficking. Can you move to the
Tráfico
next
sexual
slide?
y laboral. Vamos a pasar a la siguiente diapositiva.
Okay, so these laws, as I said, just took effect in 2007, which is relatively recent. And basically, the short answer of what human trafficking is that it's requiring that sex or labor be performed using force, fraud, or coercion. Force, fraud, or coercion. Or child trafficking, which is a new law that just took effect in 2018. As I said, there's no element of transportation needed to be established to establish a trafficking charge. Can you go to the next slide, please? The definition of labor trafficking is a person guilty of labor trafficking. Actually, I'm going to back up a little bit. There are so many different forms of trafficking, but the common denominator, the common thread that we see running through every single trafficking situation is traffickers target vulnerable members of our society. And there's so many different types of vulnerabilities they can target. It could be vulnerability because someone is facing immigration, or someone is food insecure, or suffering from homelessness, or perhaps mental health or substance abuse issues. People could be targeted because of their immigration status, by using fear of the consequence of their immigration status if they report. And the important part that I want to talk about today is the vulnerability of our youth. Children, by their nature, are vulnerable. Because of their life, they haven't had the same life experiences an adult has had. I mean, how many teenagers, I was a teenager once, we've all made poor decisions when we're teenagers. They don't understand the consequences of their actions the way adults do. But think about how much that vulnerability of a teenager compounds if that person is a product of our foster care situation or our group home situation, or doesn't have a strong social support system at home. There's a lot of studies that show that if a child does not feel safe, secure, and loved in their home environment, they're going to seek out those feelings elsewhere. And a lot of traffickers target teenagers by filling that need in them of attention, of what they perceive as love, and then using those feelings to try to convince them to do things they don't want to do. So the first example we've had is labor trafficking, and we have had children being labor trafficked. Several. We have one case pending right now where a sibling was labor trafficking her younger sister and forcing her to work and taking all of the money that she was earning. So the definition of labor trafficking, and this is why it's also important to know about the law, because a lot of our victims, especially of labor trafficking, don't self-identify as a trafficking victim because they don't understand what the law is. It's honestly, a lot of attorneys in my office that don't even understand the nuances of trafficking. It's a very specific type of crime, and a lot of, actions that are legal in people's respective home countries are not legal here. And people need to know what their rights are here once you are in the United States, and especially with respect to labor. Basically, labor trafficking, a person is guilty of labor trafficking if she harbors or induces another person or recruits, entices them to engage in labor by instilling a fear in them. This is one way. Instilling a fear in them that they'll cause some sort of physical injury to them, or they'll cause damage to their property, or damage or hurt their family, some sort of fear of injury. A person is also guilty of labor trafficking if they require the labor be performed to pay a debt that the trafficker caused. So for sometimes people will say, okay, I paid your visa, your transportation to come to the country, now you have to pay me back. That is labor trafficking, even if there's no threats of violence. Another way someone's labor trafficked, which we see often, is if their employer withholds their government-issued identification to maintain some sort of control over them, to impair their freedom of movement. So if an employer has somebody's documentation, has their passport, and is making them work, that's a form of labor trafficking. And a lot of people, especially victims who come into contact with of this crime, didn't even realize that was against the law. So I'm going to move over to one child labor trafficking case we had. Can you move to the next slide? These are places where labor trafficking takes place. The hardest part about detecting labor trafficking, which is very far underreported, is that it takes place in legitimate businesses. So it's hard to know if someone's being labor trafficked if they're working in a legitimate business. For example, sex trafficking is a little bit easier to identify because we can investigate if there's houses of prostitution, because that's against the law right now. But labor trafficking can happen in grocery stores, nail salons, hotels, and honestly in household labor as well. The largest form of labor trafficking in our country, statistically, happens in agricultural realm, which obviously we don't see much in Queens County, but a lot of these other locations we do have here in Queens County. Can you move to the next slide? This is a case that we did prosecute. We prosecuted actually both a woman and her husband who took 2 children from Korea. They took these children with the consent of their parents. They knew the parents. This woman was an aftercare tutor in Korea for the 2 children and brought them to the United States under the premise and promise of getting them a better education and get the both children in a situation where they may be able to obtain citizenship in the United States one day. However, as soon as she got them here, she immediately started forcing them to work. They were working grueling hours in the household. They were made to sleep on the floor. They were treated like servants in the house. They weren't being fed properly, and they were being held out of school to work in nail salons to babysit, to work in grocery stores doing food sampling, and it wasn't until one of the children ended up contacting her mother in Korea, her biological mother in Korea, that she reported that her mother called the local consulate. We were able to identify this trafficking was taking place. And the scary part about trafficking is it often happens, it's hidden in plain sight. We spoke to a lot of the neighbors in the area where these kids live. They went to Francis Lewis High School, and they saw the kids working. They saw them bringing in groceries, raking the lawn, mowing the lawn. And they actually, one neighbor said he was really appalled because he compared those children to his children and said, why can't you be like the neighbor's children and do some, more work around the yard? Can you go to the next slide, please? I think we're going to skip to two. You can skip to the next one. So that's just an example. You can make all of the, you can make them all come up. So, so that's one example of labor trafficking that actually was reported to us out of the high school that they went to, where they finally disclosed to a teacher. The second type of trafficking is sex trafficking. So the definition of sex trafficking is advancing or profiting from prostitution by, and there's a list of things. There's providing drugs to somebody to impair their judgment, by making false statements, misstatements, or omissions to induce them to engage in prostitution, withholding, destroying, or confiscating any government-issued identification, requiring that sex in exchange for money be performed to repay a debt. And this could be as large as a debt for transportation to this country, or it could be as small, we've seen, as traffickers buying a victim maybe alcohol or a hotel room or marijuana or clothing, and then telling the child later, okay, that wasn't for free, now you owe me, you have to work and do this. So that's the real or supported debt. And the last type of trafficking, which we really see very, very commonly, is using a scheme, plan, or pattern to compel or induce someone to either engage in or continue to engage in prostitution. And that's very important because oftentimes, okay, thank you. So a person is guilty of sex trafficking if they underline continue to engage in prostitution. Because a lot of times traffickers will manipulate, especially a minor, into engaging in prostitution by making them think it's something that's going to be glamorous. It's something that they're going to, something that's going to make them money. But then once the child starts engaging in prostitution, they realize it's not what they expected it to be. It is scary and degrading and dangerous, and then they're in a situation where they can't get out of that situation. Can you move on to the next, all of the windows? So this is the scheme, plan, or pattern to compel someone to either engage in or continue to engage in prostitution activity really hones in on instilling a fear in the victim. Now, it could be a fear of physical injury, it could be a fear of damage to their property, it could be a fear of deportation, or exposing a secret or publicizing a fact that would subject someone to ridicule. Specifically, we had this relatively recently, but we had a 14-year-old girl who I see some students are here. Who has Snapchat? Anybody have Snapchat that they're going to admit in front of their parents? A lot of our kids have Snapchat. And she was 13 years old at the time, and she took a partially naked photo of herself on Snapchat and sent it to her best friend, her girlfriend, who was 14. Our victim then turned 14, and her best friend, who she sent the photo to, shared that photo with her boyfriend, who was 18 years old. That boyfriend then threatens the victim that if she doesn't make $250 for him, that he's going to post that photo on Instagram. and he blackmailed her to engage in a prostitution act with somebody in the neighborhood to give him this money from the fear that he's just going to post a partially nude photo of her, which would subject her to ridicule. So that's another way somebody is trafficked, which is fear of embarrassing someone. Often it happens too, where a lot of kids are being trafficked and they want to stop, and the trafficker will be making threats that, well, you can't stop, because if you stop, I'm going to tell your mother what you did. I'm going to tell your boyfriend what you did. I'm going to tell your classmates, and everyone's going to know you're quote-unquote a prostitute. And that is a way where traffickers continue to exploit people over and over again. A lot of traffickers also will make victims feel like they're going to get in trouble if they report. They'll tell them, you're going to get deported because you're not documented, so good luck going to the police. They'll oftentimes threaten victims with you engage in prostitution and that's a crime, so they're going to arrest you if you go try to report this. Or you're working and you're not paying taxes, so they're going to detain you for committing that crime. So none of this is true, but it's the ways traffickers maintain control over other people. There are a few other lists of things, of fears that traffickers instill, and it's a catch-all that's, really also requiring that prostitution be performed with instilling a fear that he or she will kidnap or commit the crime of unlawful imprisonment in the second degree. And there's a catch-all that if somebody instills a fear that the trafficker will do any act calculated to hurt somebody with respect to their health, safety, or immigration status. You can move on to the next slide. There's been a lot of changes, and I'm not going to go through all of them, but a very, very important change I want to bring up to you. There's been two very significant changes. One was in 2016, where basically a lot of the penalties for trafficking were increased. But also in 2016, the word prostitute was eliminated from the New York State penal law. It was completely eliminated. And the reason why it was eliminated is because of the derogatory term used to belittle and marginalize people who are likely being victimized or exploited in some way. So that word has been eliminated, and it was also a word that was being used to describe our youth, which is not appropriate, who are children. So that's very, very important. So that's a word we really should all try to eliminate from our language. Can you move on to the next slide, please? But the biggest success we've had came in 2018, where the child sex trafficking statute was enacted. So everything I've spoken about up to date, the force, fraud, or coercion, none of that needs to be proven anymore if you are trafficking somebody under 18 years old. So if you're an adult, if you're 21 years or older, and you advance or profit from the prostitution of any individual under 18, you are per se guilty, strict liability crime of sex trafficking of a child, which is a B violent felony, and you could be facing anywhere from 5 to 25 years incarceration. So this was a huge success, especially because it's hard for a lot of children to even talk about what happened to them. It's also enabled us to get certain indictments and convictions for trafficking of a child, even without requiring the child to testify. We were able to use extrinsic evidence that a person was advancing or profiting from the prostitution of a minor without putting that victim through the stress and the trauma of coming to court and testifying. Can you move to the next slide? You can make them up. Thank you. These are ways we're seeing people are being trafficked. Obviously, you're familiar, I'm sure, with the brothels. Roosevelt Avenue is in the press often. There are residential brothels. There are also commercial brothels and illicit massage parlors. There are people trafficked through escort agencies. But the most trafficking we're seeing now is online, especially with respect to our youth. They're being advertised online and trafficked out of a lot of our local hotels. This has been always the issue. It's been happening for quite some time, but it even increased during the pandemic and the advent of the social media. We have a lot of victims that are trafficked along social media as well. Can you move to the next slide, please? We talked about psychological manipulation and control a little bit, but what traffickers often do, and we have some case examples I'm going to show you, is they often use social media to make friends and acquaintances with people to target them. We call this the grooming process, where they meet an underage child, they take them to a place outside their comfort zone, they demonstrate romantic interest in them, buy them things, and then they make false promises to try to convince them to engage in prostitution. And then what the problem is there is a really horrible subculture of rules involved in this industry, and a lot of times once a child gets involved, they're not allowed to stop, and they're threatened with exposure if they do. It's also very, very difficult because, you know, in a lot of ways, prostitution is glamorized by our media as empowering for women, and traffickers will use that to really to help convince victims to engage in prostitution. Can you move to the next slide? I think it's included. There's something now, there's more experts that we're using as well in traumatic bonding and the psychological control to explain what goes on in a trafficking situation. Traffickers often cause victims, as I said, to be fearful of law enforcement. So it's important that we spread the word to people in our community that there's help that can be found. And I'll talk to you a little bit more at the end of the presentation about what resources we have and what things we're doing to help trafficking survivors. And I'm hoping to open it up to questions to you too. I think we'll have plenty of time for that. Can you move to the next slide? It's very similar to gang, and honestly, it's often people are trafficked within gangs. At times, traffickers have been branding victims as well as a way to psychologically
needs, which I don't have any money for that. And so the 14-year-old said, you know what, I don't either, but I know somebody who will give us money. This guy who lives in the area, and if we just go to his house, we'll have to fool around with him, but he'll give us a lot of money, we can do whatever we want. Our victim went to his house, and immediately was shocked to see he was so old. She expected him to be much younger. And she didn't want to engage in the sex act with him anymore. But she explained that the reason why she did is she felt like because she already agreed, she couldn't take it back. It's also important for us to talk to our kids about consent, and that consent is something that is fluid. It can be given and it can be taken away if you feel uncomfortable in a situation. Literally, she felt like because she agreed to do it, she had to give it. She did. Then the defendant ended up telling her about other girls from school that were coming over there after school, mentioned a few of them, and asked her to recruit any of her other friends to come over. And in fact, they actually called him up to make this date using the guidance counselor's phone. The guidance counselor, because they didn't have a phone. We were able, after she finally reported that her mother, when her mother asked the question, we were able to track down some of the other girls through the school with the school's assistant, and were able to indict him. He was convicted after trial as well, and served 2 years in jail, which we asked for much more, but it was not a trafficking. He was not charged with trafficking. He was charged with statutory rape and enticing a person for prostitution, and he has to register as a sex offender now. So that's an example of how kids can be trafficked by other kids. Because not only was our victim paid, that other girl was paid as well for just doing the introductions. And traffickers will get other kids to ask their friends, like, oh, do you know anybody else who would like to make some money? And get them involved as well. We also have increasing reports within our migrant communities as well. We had just announced a couple weeks ago a 17-year-old girl who was approached by an adult and who knew she needed money, who knew she was living in the shelter, and offered her the opportunity to make money, and he started posting her up and bringing her on prostitution dates in Queens, giving her a portion of the money, but he was keeping a large portion of the money as well. So it's what we talked about, vulnerabilities. Traffickers can identify who needs help, who needs money, who's vulnerable, and they often use that to take advantage of them. Can you go to the next slide? These are some of the red flags we're seeing: older intimate partners, any disputes inside hotel rooms, kids going into hotels or partying in hotels. A lot of these are really meant for more law enforcement responding to ads, but responding to calls, but also, Googling phone numbers is really important. Google your kids' phone numbers if you get suspicious, or and let them know that they might have classmates that are going through a situation and what they should do in that case. Because oftentimes kids will go to other kids before they'll go to a trusted adult. We had one situation during the pandemic where a mother was trying to force her daughter to go on a prostitution date, and actually took naked photos of her own daughter to send to other men. And the child was so scared, went to her best friend, and it ended up being reported when the best friend told her mother about the situation. Can you go to the next slide, please? You can put them all up there. So now, I want to just end with some of the things we can do to help. One, this is a new law that took effect. It's called the START Act. A lot of traffickers, a lot of victims or survivors of trafficking, have criminal convictions as a result of their trafficking situation. It could be prostitution convictions, but oftentimes it could be other convictions as well. A lot of times traffickers will make victims sell drugs on the prostitution date, or hold weapons when they're traveling in their purse. They don't get charged with a weapon. So there's a new law that provides if a person has a conviction as a result of a trafficking situation, they can have that conviction vacated. And my office is consenting. Our DA's office has consenting to vacature of a lot of those convictions, because we understand that those convictions interfere with
people's ability to get jobs and support themselves, which just increases the vulnerability even more. Can you just go to the next slide? Thank you. We have a victims advocates office in our office, so it's obviously reporting anything to law enforcement is scary. So we have advocates that work with our victims. They have a safe place to help guide them through the process. There's something called T visas and U visas. So while traffickers will threaten someone that they're going to get deported if they report the trafficking, really the opposite is true. There are certain visas a person is eligible for if they're in this country and they have been trafficked. And our office signs off on supplemental B affidavits to support those applications. And we oftentimes and many times refer victims to immigration lawyers. I don't know, have any of you heard about the Family Justice Center? Every borough has its own Family Justice Center, which has wraparound services right in one building. So they have a lot of legal services in our Family Justice Center where we refer victims. I talked about the post-conviction relief and vacating convictions. And we also have a lot of partner service care providers. There are a lot of organizations that are funded to assist trafficking survivors, and we definitely try. Our first priority when we come into contact with anybody is getting somebody help before we worry about the reporting situation. This is my information. This is where you can report trafficking or even anonymously ask a question or even get connected to services in any way, or to request presentations in your communities, because we want to get out as much as we can, because we learn from you, and I want to open it up to questions and find out if you're seeing any trends or if you see anything we should be looking into in our office. Because especially people, parents, the school system, and community members really are on the front lines to identify trafficking. Does anybody have any questions about trafficking or want to share any information?
Así que si alguien quiere comentar algo, si alguien tiene una pregunta, adelante.
No. Well, this is mine. If you call this number, this goes directly to me. So if anybody has any questions afterwards, if they want to call and ask and they're just being shy in public, we really are. We welcome phone calls and referrals or even anonymous information. If you see something going on in your community, our bureau is in the investigations division of the district. So we initiate proactive investigations as well. So if you see anything or you think your trafficking may be occurring, feel free to reach out directly to us for us to investigate. Thank you so much for your attention and for taking the time out to listen to this. I know it's late and everyone's tired and had a long day, but I really, really appreciate you taking the time out of your schedule to come hear about this problem that's happening and to really go back and talk to your kids about it, so that they know about this is happening, so they hear it's happening with classmates, they know it's okay to say something and it's important to say something. So thank you so much. I appreciate you all being here. Yeah, we can do that. They didn't have any questions, but maybe with the lights on, people will be more comfortable to talk.
All the sun, right?
What?
Is done?
It's done, yes, unless you have any
Thank you,
questions.
thank you.
I'm here, Sam. No, thank you for coming and listening. Thank you. Thank you. Thanks so much. I apologize for sitting. I suffered a back injury yesterday. Thank you for helping. Thank you, that worked really good. What? No Q&A. He's so shy. I left my phone number up, so hopefully,
There's also screen, so.
yeah. No questions on the screen?
Oh no, we're not live.
We're not live, so.
No, we're live. It's just, I don't know if it's a